Barren Final Reward. Magnolia Maggie Sullivan had promised herself she'd never trust a man again, but when she found herself stranded with Rhett Dawson, a gunfighter with nothing left to lose, she had no choice. He sat by the fire, watching her, his voice low. "You're scared of me," he murmured. "Smart girl. But fear won't keep you warm tonight." Chapter 1. The Broken Wagon, Broken Trust. The sun beat down on Magnolia Maggie Sullivan's back with the ferocity of a scorned lover. Sweat trickled between her shoulder blades, dampening the already worn cotton of her dress. The air, thick and heavy with the scent of dust and sage, offered no respite. Her throat was parched, her lips cracked, and a throbbing headache pulsed behind her eyes, a relentless rhythm mirroring the despair that threatened to consume her. Beside her, the wagon lay crippled, its front left wheel splintered beyond repair, a testament to the unforgiving nature of the trail and, perhaps, to her own foolish optimism. She kicked at a loose stone, sending it skittering across the parched earth. "Damn fool wagon," she muttered, the words catching in her dry throat. It wasn't just the wagon, of course. It was everything. The broken promises, the shattered dreams, the life she'd left behind in St. Louis, a life that now felt as distant and unreal as a half-remembered dream. She'd been a fool to believe him, a fool to trust in the honeyed words and charming smile of a man who'd promised her the world and delivered only heartache. She ran a calloused hand through her tangled, dust-streaked auburn hair, pulling it back from her face. The gesture revealed the fine lines etched around her eyes, the subtle droop at the corners of her mouth, the marks of a woman who had seen too much, felt too much, and lost too much. At 57, Maggie had thought she was done with heartbreak, done with trusting. She'd buried her husband, Thomas, a good, steady man, 10 years ago, and had resigned herself to a quiet life of solitude on their small farm. But then he had come along, with his promises of a new beginning, a grand adventure out west. She closed her eyes, the image of his face handsome, charming, utterly deceitful flashing behind her eyelids. The memory of his betrayal was a fresh wound, raw and stinging. He'd taken her savings, her trust, and her foolish heart, leaving her stranded in the middle of nowhere with nothing but a broken wagon and a soul full of regret. A hawk circled overhead, its sharp cry piercing the silence. Maggie watched it, a flicker of envy in her heart. To be free, to soar above the pain and disappointment, to escape the suffocating weight of her mistakes, it was a tempting thought. But she was grounded, tethered to the earth by the reality of her situation. She was alone, vulnerable, and utterly unprepared for the harsh realities of the frontier. She sank to the ground, leaning against the broken wagon, the rough wood digging into her back. Despair washed over her, a dark, suffocating tide. She'd been so careful, so determined not to repeat the mistakes of her youth. She'd built walls around her heart, brick by brick, determined to protect herself from further pain. But he'd found a way in, a chink in her armor, and had exploited it with ruthless efficiency. The sound of approaching hooves startled her. She scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her despair. Bandits? Outlaws? The stories she'd heard, dismissed as exaggerations back in St. Louis, now seemed terrifyingly real. She reached for the small, rusty pistol she kept tucked in her waistband, her hand trembling. It was a pathetic weapon, more likely to misfire than to hit its target, but it was all she had. She held it out in front of her, her grip unsteady, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. A lone rider emerged from the swirling dust, his figure silhouetted against the setting sun. He was tall and lean, his shoulders broad, his posture suggesting both strength and weariness. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face and a long, dusty duster that concealed most of his form. As he drew closer, she could make out the glint of a rifle strapped to his saddle and the dull gleam of a revolver at his hip. He reined in his horse a few yards from the wagon, his eyes, dark and unreadable, taking in the scene, the broken wagon, the disheveled woman, the fear etched on her face. He sat there for a long moment, silent and still, his presence radiating a quiet intensity that made Maggie's skin prickle. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and gravelly, tinged with a hint of something she couldn't quite place: weariness, perhaps, or maybe something darker. "Trouble, ma'am?" Maggie swallowed, trying to moisten her parched throat. My wagon will broke," she managed, her voice barely a whisper. He dismounted, his movements fluid and graceful despite the stiffness that seemed to cling to him. He walked towards her, his spurs clinking softly against the hard, packed earth. As he drew closer, she could see his face more clearly. It was a hard face, weathered and lined, with a strong jaw and a mouth set in a grim line. His eyes, though dark, held a flicker of something that might have been compassion, or perhaps just curiosity. There were deep lines scored in the corner of his eyes, the way the sun had baked lines into the desert floor. He wasn't young. She guessed, with some relief, that he was her age, or close to it. "Looks like more than just a broken wheel, ma'am," he said, his gaze sweeping over the wagon, taking in the meager supplies, the worn canvas, the overall air of desperation that clung to it. Maggie lowered the pistol slightly, her hand still shaking. "I was heading west," she said, her voice gaining a little strength, "to start a new life." He raised an eyebrow, a hint of skepticism in his expression. "Alone?" She nodded, her chin lifting in a defiant gesture. I am." He studied her for a moment, his gaze intense and unwavering. "And who are you running from, ma'am? Or maybe, what were you running to?" His words struck a nerve, exposing the raw wound of her betrayal. She flinched, her eyes filling with tears. It's none of your concern," she said, her voice thick with emotion. He didn't press her. He simply nodded, his gaze softening slightly. "Fair enough," he said. "But out here, ma'am, secrets can be as dangerous as a rattlesnake." He turned his attention to the wagon, examining the broken wheel with a practiced eye. "It's beyond repair," he said, confirming what she already knew. "You won't be going anywhere in this." Despair threatened to engulf her again, but she fought it back. She wouldn't give up. She wouldn't let him see her weakness. What am I supposed to do?" she asked, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. He looked at her, his eyes holding hers. "You can come with me," he said. "I'm heading to Dust Devil, small town not too far. You find your new beginnings from there." Maggie hesitated. Trust a stranger? After what she'd been through, it seemed like madness. But what choice did she have? She was stranded, alone, and utterly at the mercy of this enigmatic stranger. He sat near the pitiful, sputtering fire she had managed to build, the flames casting flickering shadows on his face. "You're scared of me," he murmured, his voice low, almost a whisper against the vast silence of the approaching night. Maggie looked at him, her heart pounding. He was right. She was terrified. Of him, of the wilderness, of her own vulnerability. But she also knew that she had no other option. "Smart girl," he continued, his gaze unwavering. "But fear won't keep you warm tonight." The night descended, wrapping them both in its star-strewn and deeply unsettling embrace. Chapter 2. A stranger's cold comfort. The night air, though initially a welcome relief from the scorching heat of the day, quickly turned frigid. Maggie shivered, pulling her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. The fire, built from meager scraps of dried brush and wood, offered little warmth, its flames dancing erratically in the gentle breeze. The vastness of the desert night pressed in on her, a stark contrast to the cozy, if lonely, confines of her farmhouse back in Missouri. Every rustle of the wind, every snap of a twig, sent a jolt of fear through her. Rhett Dawson, the stranger who had offered her a ride to Dust Devil, seemed unaffected by the cold. He sat across the fire from her, his back straight, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. He hadn't said much since his initial offer, and his silence was almost as unnerving as his presence. He was a puzzle, a man of few words and hidden depths, and Maggie couldn't help but wonder what secrets lay hidden beneath his rugged exterior. He'd shared his meager supplies with her, a piece of hardtack and a strip of dried beef, washed down with lukewarm water from his canteen. The food was tasteless, but she ate it gratefully, her hunger a gnawing ache that overshadowed her fear. He'd also offered her his bedroll, a thick, worn blanket that smelled of horses and leather and something indefinably him. She'd refused, of course, preferring to huddle near the fire, wrapped in her own thin shawl. The thought of sharing his bedroll, of being that close to him, was too unsettling. "You should sleep," he said, his voice breaking the silence. "We'll leave at first light." Maggie shook her head. "I couldn't possibly," she said. I'm too. She couldn't finish the sentence. Too afraid? Too wired? Too aware of his presence, of the way the firelight flickered across his hard features, illuminating the lines of weariness and something that might have been regret? He didn't argue. He simply shrugged, his gaze returning to the flames. He seemed perfectly content to sit there in silence, a solitary figure against the vast backdrop of the desert night. Maggie tried to relax, to close her eyes and find some semblance of peace, but it was impossible. Her mind was racing, replaying the events of the past few weeks, the betrayal, the loss, the sheer terror of being stranded alone in this unforgiving land. And then there was him, this stranger, this Rhett Dawson, with his offer of help and his unsettling silence. What were his motives? Why would he help a complete stranger? Was he truly as altruistic as he seemed, or was there something more to his offer? She glanced at him, studying his profile in the firelight. His face was hard, etched with the lines of a life lived on the edge, but there was also a certain sadness in his eyes, a hint of vulnerability that she hadn't noticed before. He looked like a man who had seen his share of hardship, who had carried burdens that would crush a lesser soul. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, the words escaping her lips before she could stop them. He turned his head, his dark eyes meeting hers. "Doing what?" "Helping me," she said. "You don't even know me." He shrugged again, that infuriatingly non-committal gesture that seemed to be his default response. "Doesn't matter," he said. "No one deserves to be left out here to die." But Maggie hesitated, unsure how to voice her suspicions. "But you could have just ridden on. You could have left me here." He looked at her, a flicker of something that might have been amusement in his eyes. "Maybe I could have," he said. "But I didn't." "Why?" she pressed, her voice rising slightly. "What do you want from me?" He held her gaze for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, he sighed, a low, weary sound that seemed to carry the weight of the world. "I don't want anything from you, ma'am," he said. I know what it's like to be alone, to be lost, to have nothing left to lose." His words resonated with her, striking a chord deep within her soul. She recognized the truth in them, the raw honesty of a man who had stared into the abyss and seen his own reflection. And in that moment, a flicker of trust, fragile and tentative, began to bloom within her. He stood up, stretching his long limbs, his movements stiff and deliberate. "I'm going to check on the horses," he said. "Try to get some sleep. You'll need it." He walked away, disappearing into the darkness, leaving Maggie alone with her thoughts and the flickering flames of the dying fire. She watched him go, her heart filled with a strange mixture of fear and gratitude. She still didn't know him, still didn't trust him completely, but she was beginning to believe that he wasn't a threat. He was just a man, like her, scarred by life, searching for something or perhaps running from something. She lay down on the hard ground, pulling her shawl tighter around her. The fire had dwindled to embers, casting a faint, reddish glow on the surrounding landscape. The night was silent, save for the occasional howl of a coyote in the distance. She closed her eyes, and for the first time since her world had shattered, she felt a flicker of hope. It was a small, fragile thing, easily extinguished, but it was there, a tiny spark in the darkness. She was still afraid, still uncertain of what the future held, but she was no longer completely alone. She had a stranger's cold comfort, a shared silence in the vast emptiness of the desert, and for now, that was enough. As sleep finally began to claim her, she heard the soft, rhythmic sound of Rhett Dawson's voice, humming a low, mournful tune, a melody that seemed to echo the loneliness and the resilience of the human heart. The tune wrapped around her as surely as any blanket, lulling her into a fitful, dream-haunted slumber. Chapter 3. Echoes of Gunfire and Regret. The first rays of dawn painted the eastern sky in hues of pale pink and gold, chasing away the shadows of the night. Maggie awoke with a start, her body stiff and sore from sleeping on the hard ground. The fire had long since died, leaving behind only a faint trace of smoke in the crisp morning air. Rhett was already up, tending to the horses, his movements efficient and practiced. He didn't look at her as she approached, his attention focused on tightening the saddle girth on his large, chestnut mare. "Morning," Maggie said, her voice raspy from sleep. He grunted in response, a non-committal sound that could have meant anything. He finished with the mare and moved on to Maggie's horse, a tired-looking pinto that she'd bought along with the ill-fated wagon. He examined the animal with a critical eye, running his hand along its flanks, checking its hooves. "He's seen better days," he said, his voice devoid of judgment. "He has," Maggie agreed, a touch of sadness in her voice. The pinto, like everything else she owned, was a reminder of her failed dreams. He glanced at her, a flicker of something that might have been sympathy in his eyes. "He'll get you to Dust Devil," he said. "He's got enough spirit left for that." They ate a quick breakfast of cold jerky and water, sharing the silence as they prepared to leave. Maggie watched him as he worked, his movements precise and economical, every gesture revealing a lifetime of experience in the saddle. He was a man of the West, through and through, and she couldn't help but feel a sense of awe mixed with a lingering unease at his competence and self-sufficiency. As they mounted their horses, Rhett turned to her, his dark eyes serious. "We'll ride hard," he said. "Dust Devil is a good day's ride, maybe more, depending on the terrain. We'll need to make good time." Maggie nodded, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. She was eager to reach Dust Devil, to put some distance between herself and the sight of her broken dreams, but she was also aware of the dangers that lay ahead. The trail was rough, the landscape unforgiving, and the threat of bandits or outlaws was ever present. They set off at a brisk pace, the horses' hooves kicking up clouds of dust that hung in the air like a hazy curtain. The silence between them stretched, punctuated only by the creak of leather and the rhythmic thud of hooves on the hard-packed earth. Maggie tried to focus on the scenery, the vast expanse of rolling hills and rocky canyons, but her mind kept drifting back to Rhett, to the mystery that surrounded him. She stole glances at him as they rode, studying his profile, searching for clues to his past, his motivations. His face was stoic, his expression unreadable, revealing nothing of his inner thoughts. He rode with an easy grace, his body moving in perfect rhythm with the horse, as if he were an extension of the animal itself. "You're good with horses," she said, breaking the silence, the words sounding awkward and clumsy even to her own ears. He glanced at her, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Been riding since I was a boy," he said. "It's in my blood." Where are you from?" she asked, venturing a little further, testing the boundaries of his reticence. He hesitated for a moment, his gaze shifting to the horizon. "Abilene," he said, his voice low and tinged with a hint of something she couldn't quite decipher. Abilene. The name conjured images of a rough and tumble frontier town, a place of saloons and gunfights, of lawlessness and danger. It was a place where a man like Rhett would fit right in. What were you doing there?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. He shrugged, that familiar gesture that seemed to deflect any personal inquiry. "This and that," he said. "Mostly trouble." A sudden burst of gunfire shattered the silence, the sound echoing through the canyons. Maggie gasped, her heart leaping into her throat. Rhett reacted instantly, pulling his horse to a halt, his eyes scanning the surrounding landscape. "Get down," he ordered, his voice sharp and urgent. Maggie obeyed, sliding off her horse and crouching low to the ground, her body trembling. She fumbled for the rusty pistol in her waistband, her hand shaking so badly she could barely hold it. Another volley of shots rang out, closer this time. Maggie could hear the whine of bullets passing overhead. She squeezed her eyes shut, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. This was it, she thought. This was how it ended. She'd escaped one disaster only to meet her end in a hail of gunfire in the middle of nowhere. She heard Rhett return fire, the roar of his rifle a deafening counterpoint to the sharp crack of the attacker's weapons. He fired with deadly accuracy, his movements calm and deliberate, as if he were accustomed to this kind of life or death situation. Which, Maggie realized with a chilling certainty, he probably was. The gunfight was brief, but intense. Maggie huddled on the ground, her ears ringing, her body shaking, praying for it to be over. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the shooting stopped. Silence descended, heavy and ominous. Maggie slowly raised her head, her eyes wide with fear. She saw Rhett standing over the bodies of two men, his rifle still smoking. He looked at her, his expression grim. "You all right?" he asked, his voice surprisingly gentle. Maggie nodded, her voice caught in her throat. She couldn't speak, couldn't tear her gaze away from the dead men. They were young, barely more than boys, their faces contorted in the final throes of death. Rhett holstered his rifle, his movements slow and deliberate. He walked towards her, his boots crunching on the gravelly earth. He knelt beside her, his eyes searching hers. "They were after the horses," he said, his voice low and filled with a weariness that seemed to go beyond the immediate situation. "Or maybe just looking for trouble. Doesn't matter now." He reached out and gently touched her arm, his hand surprisingly warm against her cold skin. "It's over," he said. "You're safe." Maggie looked at him, her eyes filling with tears. She was safe, yes, but she was also profoundly shaken. She'd witnessed violence, death, and the casual brutality of this unforgiving land. And she'd seen another side of Rhett Dawson, the gunfighter, the man who could kill without hesitation. The echoes of the gunfire seemed to reverberate not just through the canyon, but through the deepest chambers of her heart, stirring up old regrets and long-buried fears. The weight of her past and the uncertainty of her future pressed down on her with renewed force. Chapter 4. The Price of Survival, the Cost of Hope. The aftermath of the gunfight hung heavy in the air, a palpable tension that overshadowed the vast, silent landscape. Maggie, still trembling from the encounter, watched as Rhett efficiently searched the bodies of the dead men. He found little of value: a few coins, a couple of war knives, and a half-empty bottle of cheap whiskey. He took nothing, leaving the bodies where they lay, a grim testament to the harsh realities of the frontier. "We need to move," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Someone might have heard the shots." Maggie nodded, her throat still tight with fear. She remounted her horse, her hands shaking, her body aching. She felt a profound sense of unease, not just from the violence she'd witnessed, but from the realization that she was utterly dependent on this man, this stranger who had just killed two men with such cold efficiency. They rode in silence for hours, the only sound the rhythmic thud of hooves and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. The sun climbed higher in the sky, beating down on them with relentless intensity. Maggie's thoughts were a jumbled mess of fear, confusion, and a growing sense of despair. She'd come west seeking a new beginning, a chance to escape the pain of her past, but she'd found only more hardship and uncertainty. She glanced at Rhett, his profile stark against the bright blue sky. He rode with his usual stoicism, his expression unreadable. She wondered what he was thinking, what he was feeling. Did he regret killing those men? Did he feel any remorse? Or was it just another day in the life of a gunfighter? "Were you ever married?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. It was a personal question, perhaps too personal, but she needed to know something, anything, about this man who held her life in his hands. He glanced at her, his dark eyes betraying a flicker of surprise. He hesitated for a moment, as if weighing his response. "Once," he said, his voice low and tinged with a hint of something that might have been sadness. "A long time ago." What happened?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked away, his gaze fixed on the horizon. She died, he said, his voice flat and emotionless. Fever. Maggie felt a pang of sympathy for him. She knew what it was like to lose a spouse, to feel the emptiness and the grief that never truly went away. She'd lost Thomas to pneumonia, a slow, agonizing decline that had left her heartbroken and alone. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice sincere. He shrugged, that familiar gesture that seemed to dismiss any expression of sympathy or concern. "It was a long time ago," he repeated. "Life goes on." But did it? Maggie wondered. Did it ever truly go on after such a loss? Or did you just learn to live with the pain, to carry it with you like a heavy burden that never truly lightened? They rode on, the silence stretching between them, punctuated only by the sounds of the wilderness. Maggie's thoughts drifted back to her own life, to the choices she'd made, the mistakes she'd regretted. She'd loved Thomas, in her own quiet way, but their marriage had been more of a comfortable companionship than a passionate romance. And then he had come along, the charming rogue who had swept her off her feet and shattered her illusions. She'd been so foolish, so naive, to believe in his promises. She'd allowed herself to be seduced by the dream of a new life, a grand adventure, ignoring the warning signs, the nagging doubts that had whispered in the back of her mind. She'd paid a heavy price for her folly, losing everything she'd held dear. The price of survival, she thought, was steep. It demanded strength, resilience, and a willingness to do whatever it took to stay alive. But what was the cost of hope? Was it worth clinging to the dream of a better future, even when the odds were stacked against you? As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the landscape, they reached a small, secluded canyon. Rhett reined in his horse, his eyes scanning the surroundings. "We'll camp here for the night," he said. "It's sheltered, and there's a small spring nearby." Maggie nodded, grateful for the respite. She was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. She dismounted, her legs stiff and sore, and helped Red unpack the horses. They built a small fire, the flames casting a warm, flickering glow on the canyon walls. As they sat by the fire, eating their meager supper, Maggie looked at Rhett, her heart filled with a strange mixture of gratitude and apprehension. He'd saved her life, twice now, and she owed him more than she could ever repay. But she still didn't know him, still didn't trust him completely. He was a mystery, a man of contradictions, and she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to him than met the eye. The cost of hope, she was learning, was often paid in uncertainty, and the price of survival was sometimes a heavy reliance on those who walked in the shadows. And tonight, her survival, her fragile hope, rested entirely on the shoulders of a man haunted by his past, a man who carried the scent of gunpowder and regret like a second skin. The air grew cold, the stars pricked holes in the canvas above them, and still, she didn't know his full name. Chapter 5. Beneath a Sky of Indifference. The night in the canyon was a tapestry woven with unease and a fragile, burgeoning trust. Maggie slept fitfully, her dreams a chaotic mix of gunfire, broken wagons, and Rhett Dawson's enigmatic face. Every rustle of the wind, every snap of a twig, brought her to the edge of wakefulness, her heart pounding with a fear that was slowly becoming familiar. Yet, despite her fear, she found a strange comfort in Rhett's presence. He remained awake long after she had drifted off, sitting by the dying embers of the fire, his rifle across his lap, a silent sentinel against the dangers of the night. When she awoke at dawn, the sky was a vast, pale canvas, streaked with the first hints of color. Rhett was already up, his back to her, tending to the horses. He moved with a quiet efficiency, his actions betraying a deep connection to the animals. She watched him for a moment, admiring the way the early morning light caught the lines of his face, softening the harshness, revealing a hint of vulnerability. "Sleep well?" he asked, his voice low, not turning around. Maggie sat up, stretching her stiff limbs. As well as could be expected, she replied, a hint of wryness in her voice. He turned then, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You're tougher than you look, Maggie Sullivan," he said. It was the first time he'd used her full name, and it sent a surprising shiver through her. It felt intimate, a small acknowledgement of their shared experience, their fragile bond. "And you're more human than you let on, Rhett Dawson," she replied, holding his gaze. His smile faded, replaced by that familiar stoicism. "Don't go reading too much into things, ma'am," he said. "I'm just a man trying to get by." "We all are," Maggie said, her voice soft. "Just trying to get by." They ate a quick breakfast, the silence between them less strained than before. There was a subtle shift in their dynamic, a growing understanding that transcended words. They were two strangers, thrown together by circumstance, bound by a shared need for survival. But they were also two individuals, each carrying their own burdens, their own regrets, their own flickering hopes. As they rode out of the canyon, the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting a golden glow on the rugged landscape. The vastness of the open country stretched before them, a seemingly endless expanse of rolling hills, rocky outcrops, and sparse vegetation. It was a beautiful, unforgiving land, indifferent to the struggles of those who dared to traverse it. "How much further to Dust Devil?" Maggie asked, breaking the silence. Rhett squinted at the horizon. "Another day, maybe less if we push hard," he said. "It's not much of a town, but it's got a general store, a saloon, and a sheriff. Enough to get you started." "And what about you?" Maggie asked. "What will you do?" He shrugged. "Move on," he said. "That's what I do." "To where?" He didn't answer, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. He seemed to be looking at something beyond the physical landscape, something that only he could see. Maggie didn't press him. She understood his reticence, his reluctance to reveal too much of himself. She had her own secrets, her own reasons for wanting to leave the past behind. They were both running from something, she realized, and perhaps that was what drew them together, that shared sense of loss and longing. They rode in silence for a while, the only sound the rhythmic thud of hooves and the occasional cry of a bird. Maggie's thoughts drifted back to her life in St. Louis, to the comfortable routine, the familiar faces, the sense of belonging that she'd taken for granted. She'd left it all behind, chasing a foolish dream, and now she was here, in this vast, unforgiving land, with nothing but the clothes on her back and the uncertain companionship of a stranger. But she wasn't afraid, not anymore. Not entirely. The fear was still there, lurking beneath the surface, but it was tempered by a growing sense of resilience, a newfound determination to survive, to rebuild, to find a place for herself in this new world. She looked at Rhett, his profile stark against the bright blue sky. He was a hard man, a dangerous man, but he was also a man of his word. He'd promised to get her to Dust Devil, and she believed him. He was her protector, her guide, her unlikely savior, and for the first time since her world had shattered, she felt a flicker of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, she could find a new beginning beneath this sky of indifference. This vast, uncaring sky, she realized, was also a blank canvas, a place to start anew. The thought settled in her heart, a small, warm ember against the vast, cold unknown. The setting sun cast long, cool shadows. She almost asked his full name again, but held back at the last second. Chapter 6. Scars that whisper, wounds that bind. The afternoon sun beat down relentlessly, turning the landscape into a shimmering haze. The air was thick and dry, making it difficult to breathe. Maggie's throat was parched, her lips cracked, and her head throbbed with a dull ache. She'd long since run out of water, and Rhett had shared the last of his, a gesture that spoke volumes about his character. He seemed unaffected by the heat, his body accustomed to the harsh conditions of the frontier. He rode with his usual stoicism, his eyes scanning the horizon, alert to any signs of danger. Maggie, however, was struggling. She felt weak and lightheaded, her vision blurring at the edges. She knew she needed to rest, to find some shade, but she didn't want to slow them down. She didn't want to be a burden. "You all right?" Rhett asked, his voice sharp with concern. He'd noticed her swaying in the saddle. Maggie forced a smile. "Just a little tired," she said, trying to sound stronger than she felt. He didn't believe her. He reined in his horse, his eyes searching hers. "We'll stop," he said. "There's a small outcrop of rocks up ahead. We can find some shade there." Maggie didn't argue. She was too grateful for the respite. She slid off her horse, her legs wobbly, and stumbled towards the rocks, seeking the meager shade they offered. Rhett followed, helping her to sit down, his hand surprisingly gentle on her arm. He examined her with a practiced eye, his expression grim. "You're dehydrated," he said. "And you've got a touch of sunstroke. We need to get you cooled down." He took off his duster, revealing a worn, sweat-stained shirt underneath. He soaked a bandana in water from a small, hidden spring he'd somehow located nearby and gently dabbed it on her forehead and neck. The cool water felt heavenly against her burning skin.
"Rest," he said.
"I'll take care of the horses." Maggie closed her eyes, grateful for his care. She felt utterly helpless, dependent on this stranger who had become her lifeline. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her mind filled with fragmented images and half-formed thoughts. She awoke to the sound of Rhett's voice, low and soothing. He was sitting beside her, holding a cup of water to her lips. "Drink slowly," he said. Maggie obeyed, sipping the cool water, feeling it revive her parched throat. She felt a little better, the dizziness receding, the throbbing in her head subsiding. "Thank you," she said, her voice weak but sincere. He nodded, his gaze softening. "You're welcome," he said. "You gave me a scare." They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the gentle breeze rustling through the sparse vegetation. Maggie looked at Rhett, studying his face in the fading light. She noticed a scar, a thin, white line that ran from his temple to his jaw, partially hidden by his beard. It was a reminder of the violence he'd seen, the dangers he'd faced. How did you get that?" she asked, pointing to the scar. He touched it unconsciously, his fingers tracing the line. "Knife fight," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Abilene." Of course, Maggie thought. Abilene. The town that had shaped him, marked him, both physically and emotionally. You've seen a lot of violence, haven't you?" she said, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded, his gaze distant.
"Too much," he said.
"It changes a man."
"Does it?"
Maggie asked. "Does it have to?" He looked at her, his eyes searching hers.
"I don't know," he said.
"I hope not." She saw something in his eyes then, a flicker of vulnerability, a hint of the man he might have been before the violence, before the loss, before the scars. It was a fleeting glimpse, but it was enough to make her heart ache for him. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers calloused but surprisingly gentle. "You have scars too, Maggie Sullivan," he said, his voice low and husky. "Not on your skin, maybe, but they're there. I can see them." Maggie's eyes filled with tears. He saw her, she realized. He saw through her defenses, through her attempts to appear strong and independent. He saw the pain, the loss, the betrayal that she carried within her. "We're both wounded, aren't we?" she said, her voice trembling. He nodded, his gaze holding hers. "Maybe that's why we found each other," he said. "Maybe we can help each other heal." The words hung in the air between them, a fragile promise, a tentative hope. They were two damaged souls, drawn together by circumstance and a shared need for solace. They were bound by the scars that whispered of their pasts and by the wounds that, perhaps, could lead them to a future they hadn't dared to imagine. The sun dipped below the horizon, bathing the landscape in a soft, warm glow. He didn't move his hand. He simply sat, looking at her, his callous thumb gently tracing the line of her jaw, a silent acknowledgement of the pain they both carried, a silent promise of something more. Chapter 7. The Ghost of Abilene. They reached the outskirts of Dust Devil as the sun was setting, casting long, purple shadows across the dusty landscape. The town was smaller than Maggie had anticipated, a cluster of weathered buildings huddled together as if seeking protection from the vast emptiness that surrounded it. A single, dusty main street ran through the center, lined with a few ramshackle businesses, a general store, a blacksmith shop, a saloon with a faded sign proclaiming it the last chance, and a small, two-story building that served as both the sheriff's office and the jail. Home sweet home, Rhett said, his voice tinged with irony. For a few hours, anyway. Maggie looked at him, her heart filled with a mixture of relief and apprehension. She was grateful to have reached their destination, to have survived the perilous journey, but she was also uncertain about what the future held. She was alone again, in a strange town, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a few meager belongings. "What will you do now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He shrugged, that familiar gesture that seemed to deflect any personal inquiry.
"Move on," he said.
"Find some work. Stay out of trouble. Will you come back?" she asked, the words slipping out before she could stop them. She knew it was a foolish question, a naive hope, but she couldn't help but feel a sense of loss at the thought of him leaving. He looked at her, his dark eyes serious. "I don't know, Maggie," he said. "I don't make promises I can't keep." He dismounted, his movements stiff and deliberate. He helped her down from her horse, his hand lingering on hers for a moment longer than necessary. "You'll be all right here," he said. "Dust Devil is a quiet town mostly. Just keep your head down and stay out of trouble." He walked her to the general store, a small, cluttered building filled with the scent of dust, leather, and dried goods. The storekeeper, a wizened old man with a kindly face, greeted them with a nod. "Evening, Rhett," he said.
"New face in town?"
Rhett nodded.
"Maggie Sullivan," he said.
"She's looking for a fresh start." The storekeeper looked at Maggie, his eyes assessing her with a practiced gaze. "Welcome to Dust Devil, Miss Sullivan," he said. "Hope you find what you're looking for." Maggie managed a weak smile.
"Thank you," she said.
Rhett bought her a few basic supplies, some food, a blanket, a new canteen, and paid for them with a few coins he pulled from his pocket. He didn't say much, but his actions spoke volumes about his character. He was a man of few words, but his deeds were those of a good, decent human being, despite the darkness that seemed to cling to him. He walked her to the edge of town, to a small, empty cabin that stood on the outskirts. It was dilapidated, the roof sagging, the windows boarded up, but it was shelter. "It's not much," Rhett said, "but it's better than nothing. I know the owner. He won't mind you staying here for a few nights." Maggie looked at the cabin, her heart sinking. It was a far cry from the comfortable home she'd left behind, but she was grateful for it. She was tired, exhausted, and she needed a place to rest, to gather her strength, to figure out what to do next. "Thank you, Rhett," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "For everything." He nodded, his gaze holding hers. "Take care of yourself, Maggie Sullivan," he said. "And try to stay out of trouble." He turned to leave, his figure silhouetted against the setting sun. Maggie watched him go, her heart aching with a sense of loss that she couldn't quite explain. She'd known him for only a few days, but he'd become a part of her life, a lifeline in a sea of uncertainty. As he disappeared down the dusty road, a sudden gust of wind whipped through the town, carrying with it the faint sound of music, laughter, and gunfire. Maggie's heart skipped a beat. The sound came from the saloon, the last chance. It was a reminder of the violence that lurked beneath the surface of this seemingly quiet town, the violence that had shaped Rhett Dawson's life, the violence that he was now walking back into. The ghost of Abilene, she realized, wasn't just a place, but a presence, a shadow that followed him, a constant reminder of the life he couldn't escape. She stood there for a long moment, listening to the sounds of the saloon, her heart filled with a growing sense of dread. She whispered a small prayer. For herself, but also a larger one, this time for the stranger riding slowly back into the shadows. Chapter 8.
À d'espérates bargains, à fragile alliance.
Maggie spent the next few days cleaning the dilapidated cabin, making it habitable. It was hard work, scrubbing floors, patching holes in the walls, and chasing out the various critters that had taken up residence, but it was also therapeutic. It gave her a sense of purpose, a feeling of accomplishment, a small measure of control in a world that felt increasingly chaotic. She learned from the kindly storekeeper, Mr. Abernathy, that the cabin belonged to a prospector named Silas, who was away on a long trip, searching for his elusive fortune. Silas was known for his generosity, and Mr. Abernathy assured Maggie that he wouldn't mind her staying there, as long as she kept the place tidy. Dust Devil was, as Rhett had said, a quiet town. Most of the residents were farmers or ranchers, hard-working folk who kept to themselves. There were a few drifters passing through, and the occasional gambler or gunslinger, drawn to the saloon, the last chance, which seemed to be the center of the town's limited social life. Maggie avoided the saloon, preferring the solitude of her cabin and the company of Mr. Abernathy, who often shared stories of the town's history and its inhabitants. She learned about the ongoing feud between two ranching families, the McCoys and the Hatfields, a rivalry that had spanned generations and occasionally erupted into violence. She heard whispers of a corrupt sheriff, a man named Barlow, who is said to be in the pocket of the McCoys. She also learned more about Rhett Dawson. He was a known figure in Dust Devil, a man who drifted in and out of town, taking on odd jobs, mostly as a hired gun. He had a reputation for being skilled with a weapon, but also for being fair and honest, a man who lived by his own code. He was respected, but also feared, and most people gave him a wide berth. Maggie hadn't seen him since he'd left her at the cabin, but she often thought of him, wondering where he was, what he was doing. She felt a strange connection to him, a bond forged in the crucible of their shared experience. She knew he was a dangerous man, a man haunted by his past, but she also believed that he was a good man at heart. One evening, as she was sitting on the porch of her cabin, watching the sunset, she saw a rider approaching. It was Rhett. Her heart skipped a beat, a mixture of relief and apprehension flooding through her. He dismounted, his movements stiff and deliberate. He looked tired, his face drawn and weary. There was a fresh bruise on his cheek and a cut above his eye. "Rhett," Maggie said, her voice filled with concern. "What happened?" He shrugged, dismissing her concern. "Nothing I couldn't handle," he said. "Just a little disagreement at the saloon." Maggie knew it was more than that. She'd heard the stories, the whispers about Rhett's involvement in the McCoy-Hatfield feud. He'd been hired by the Hatfields, she'd learned, to protect their cattle from the McCoys' rustlers. "You need to be careful," she said, her voice trembling. "This feud, it's dangerous." He looked at her, his dark eyes serious. "I know what I'm doing, Maggie," he said. "I can take care of myself." But Maggie hesitated, unsure how to voice her fears. "But you could get killed." He smiled, a faint, sad smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "We all die sometime, Maggie," he said. "It's how we live that matters." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small pouch. "I brought you something," he said. "Some money. For supplies. And for your trouble." Maggie shook her head. "I don't want your money, Rhett," she said. "You've already done too much for me." He pressed the pouch into her hand. "Take it," he said. "You need it. And I owe you. For saving my life. Back there, in the canyon. After the gunfight. You could have left me there, but you didn't." Maggie remembered that day, the fear, the desperation, the decision she'd made to stay with him, to help him. She hadn't thought of it as saving his life, but perhaps it was. "We saved each other," she said, her voice soft. He nodded, his gaze holding hers. "Maybe we did," he said. He stayed for a while, sitting on the porch with her, sharing a silent companionship. He didn't say much, but his presence was comforting. He was a strong, silent presence in a world that felt increasingly uncertain. As he was leaving, he turned to her, his eyes filled with a strange intensity. "I need your help, Maggie," he said. Maggie's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean?" He explained that the Hatfields had made a desperate bargain, a secret alliance with a group of outlaws, to help them fight the McCoys. The outlaws were ruthless, dangerous men, and Rhett didn't trust them. He needed someone on the inside, someone who could gather information, someone who could be his eyes and ears. "I need you to work at the saloon," he said. "The last chance. It's the only way to get close to the McCoys, to find out what they're planning." Maggie was shocked. The saloon was the last place she wanted to be. It was a den of vice, a place of violence and danger. But she also knew that Rhett wouldn't ask her unless it was important.
And she owed him.
I don't know, Rhett, she said, her voice trembling. It's dangerous.
I know it is, he said.
But I wouldn't ask you if I didn't think you could handle it.
You're strong, Maggie.
Stronger than you think.
And I'll be there.
I'll protect you. It was a desperate bargain, a fragile alliance. A gunfighter and a woman running from her past, thrown together in a dangerous game of deception and survival. But beneath the fear and the uncertainty, there was a flicker of something else.
Trust.
And perhaps something more. He looked at her, pleading with just his eyes. This wasn't just about him or the feud. It was about something bigger. It was about right and wrong. Chapter 9. Shadows in the Canyon. Maggie stared at Rhett, the saloon's proposition hanging heavy in the air between them. The idea of working at the last chance sent a shiver of fear down her spine. It was a place of shadows and whispers, of rough men and loose women, a far cry from the quiet life she'd hoped to find in Dust Devil. But she also saw the desperation in Rhett's eyes, the plea for help that he couldn't quite voice. She owed him her life, several times over, and she couldn't ignore his request, no matter how dangerous it seemed. All right, Rhett, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. I'll do it. A flicker of relief crossed his face, quickly replaced by his usual stoicism. Thank you, Maggie, he said. I won't forget this. He explained the plan in more detail. She would work as a barmaid, serving drinks, cleaning tables, and keeping her ears open. She would listen for any gossip, any hints of the McCoys' plans, any information that could help the Hatfields. Rhett would be her contact, meeting her discreetly, outside of town, to exchange information. It won't be easy, he warned. The McCoys are suspicious of everyone, especially strangers. And Barlow, the sheriff, he's in their pocket. You need to be careful. Maggie nodded, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. She knew the risks, but she was committed. She wouldn't let Rhett down. The next day, Maggie walked into the Last Chance saloon, her stomach churning with nerves. The saloon was dimly lit, smoky, and filled with the sounds of raucous laughter, clinking glasses, and the tinny music of a piano player. The air smelled of stale beer, sweat, and cheap perfume. A handful of men, mostly ranchers and cowboys, were gathered at the bar, their faces rough and weathered, their eyes watchful. The saloon owner, a burly man with a handlebar mustache and a suspicious gaze, looked her up and down. You looking for work? He asked, his voice gruff. Yes, sir, Maggie said, trying to sound confident. I'm a hard worker, and I'm not afraid of a little dirt. He grunted, seemingly unimpressed. We'll see about that, he said. Can you pour a drink without spilling it? Maggie nodded, and he gestured her behind the bar. She spent the next few hours serving drinks, cleaning tables, and trying to ignore the lewd comments and suggestive glances of some of the patrons. It was a degrading, exhausting experience, but she persevered, reminding herself that she was doing this for Rhett, for a cause that was greater than her own discomfort. She quickly learned the dynamics of the saloon, the regulars, the drifters, the troublemakers. She observed the interactions between the men, the whispered conversations, the coded glances. She noticed the presence of several men she recognized as belonging to the McCoy clan, their faces hard and unfriendly, their eyes constantly scanning the room. She also saw Sheriff Barlow, a tall, imposing man with a cold, calculating gaze. He sat at a table in the corner, playing poker with a group of men, his presence casting a shadow of authority and intimidation over the entire saloon. Maggie kept her head down, her ears open, and her mouth shut. She listened, she observed, she absorbed. She was a sponge, soaking up information, waiting for the right moment to squeeze it out. As the evening wore on, she overheard a conversation between two of the McCoy men, their voices low and conspiratorial. They were talking about a shipment of cattle, a secret rendezvous, a plan to ambush the Hatfields. Maggie's heart raced. This was it, the information Rhett needed. She waited for a chance to slip away, to meet Rhett and relay the information. But as she was cleaning a table near the door, she saw Sheriff Barlow approaching her, his eyes fixed on her with a menacing intensity. You, he said, his voice cold and sharp. The new girl. Come with me. Maggie's blood ran cold. She knew she was in trouble. She followed Barlow to a small, back room, her heart pounding in her chest. He closed the door behind them, his presence filling the small space, his shadow looming over her. I've been watching you, he said, his voice low and threatening. You're asking too many questions. You're listening too closely. Who are you working for? Maggie tried to remain calm, to appear innocent, but her fear was overwhelming. I don't know what you're talking about, Sheriff, she stammered. I'm just a barmaid. I'm just trying to do my job. Barlow smiled, a cruel, chilling smile that sent shivers down her spine. Don't play dumb with me, girl, he said. I know you're working for the Hatfields. I know you're spying for Red Dawson. He grabbed her arm, his grip tight and painful. Maggie cried out, struggling to break free, but he was too strong. He pulled her close, his face inches from hers, his breath hot on her skin. You're going to tell me everything you know, he said, his voice a menacing whisper. Or you're going to regret it. Just then, the door burst open, and Rhett stood there, his gun drawn, his eyes blazing with fury. Let her go, Barlow, he said, his voice cold and deadly. The shadows in the canyon had followed them into town, Maggie realized, and now they threatened to consume them both. The fragile alliance, the desperate bargain, had led them to this moment, a confrontation that could very well be their last. She stared at Rhett, and then back at the sheriff. She knew what she had to do. Chapter 10. The unforgiving land, the unyielding heart. The tension in the small, back room of the saloon crackled like a live wire. Rhett stood, a figure of righteous fury, his gun trained on Sheriff Barlow, his eyes locked onto the lawman's with a deadly intensity. Maggie, still held captive in Barlow's grip, felt a surge of both fear and relief. Rhett had come for her, just as he'd promised. But she knew this was a dangerous situation, one that could easily escalate into violence. Dawson, Barlow sneered, his grip tightening on Maggie's arm. Always sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. Let her go, Barlow, Rhett repeated, his voice unwavering. This is between you and me. You think you can just waltz in here and threaten me? Barlow laughed, a harsh, grating sound. I'm the law in this town. You're a corrupt, two-bit bully, Rhett retorted. And you're in league with the McCoys. Everyone knows it. Barlow's eyes narrowed. You got proof of that, Dawson? I will have, Rhett said. And when I do, you'll be hanging from the nearest tree. Maggie knew Rhett was bluffing, trying to intimidate Barlow, to buy her some time. But she also knew that Barlow was a dangerous man, a man who wouldn't hesitate to kill to protect his interests. Let me go, Sheriff, Maggie said, her voice trembling but firm. You don't want to do this. Barlow looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of contempt and something else, something that Maggie couldn't quite decipher. It was a look of desperation, perhaps, or maybe even fear. He knew he was cornered, that his carefully constructed world of corruption and power was crumbling around him. Shut up, girl, he snarled. You're in this as deep as he is. He tightened his grip on her arm, and Maggie winced in pain. She saw Rhett's jaw clench, his finger tightening on the trigger of his gun. She knew he was ready to shoot, to risk everything to save her. But before he could, Maggie acted. She stomped on Barlow's foot with all her might, digging her heel into his instep. He yelped in pain, his grip loosening for a split second. It was all the time Maggie needed. She wrenched her arm free, shoved him away, and scrambled towards Rhett. Rhett didn't hesitate. He fired his gun, not at Barlow, but at the lamp hanging from the ceiling. The lamp shattered, plunging the room into darkness. Maggie heard Barlow curse, followed by the sound of scuffling and gunshots. Rhett grabbed her hand, pulling her towards the door. Run, Maggie, he shouted. They burst out of the back room, into the chaos of the saloon. The gunshots had startled the patrons, sending them scrambling for cover. Tables were overturned, glasses were shattered, and the piano player had stopped playing, his hands frozen above the keys. Rhett and Maggie raced through the saloon, dodging panicked patrons, heading for the front door. Barlow's voice rang out, shouting orders, but his men were hesitant, confused by the darkness and the chaos. They reached the front door and burst out into the night, the cool air a welcome relief from the smoky confines of the saloon. They ran down the dusty street, their footsteps echoing in the stillness, heading for the outskirts of town, for the safety of Maggie's cabin. They didn't stop running until they reached the cabin, breathless and panting. Maggie slammed the door shut, bolting it behind them. They stood there for a moment, catching their breath, listening for any sounds of pursuit. "Are you all right?" Rhett asked, his voice filled with concern. Maggie nodded, her heart still pounding. "Yes," she said. "Thanks to you." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "I told you it was dangerous," he said. "I know," Maggie replied. But I had to do it. I had to help you." He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. "You're brave, Maggie Sullivan," he said. "Braver than you know." Maggie felt a warmth spread through her, a feeling of connection to this man that went beyond gratitude, beyond shared danger. It was something deeper, something more profound. They stood there for a long moment, their gazes locked, the silence between them filled with unspoken emotions. The unforgiving land outside, the harsh realities of their situation, seemed to fade away, replaced by a sense of intimacy, a fragile hope for something more. The unyielding heart, Maggie realized, was not just a description of the land, but of herself. She had survived, she had endured, and she had found, in the most unlikely of places, a connection that gave her strength, a reason to keep fighting. She looked at Rhett, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear, gratitude, and something else, something that she was only just beginning to understand. It was a feeling that had been buried deep within her, a feeling she thought she'd lost forever. It was hope, and it was terrifying. Chapter 11. Whispers of a Hidden Past. The days following the confrontation at the saloon were tense and uncertain. Maggie and Rhett remained holed up in the cabin, venturing out only when necessary, keeping a low profile. They knew Barlow would be looking for them, seeking revenge, and they couldn't risk being seen together. Rhett spent most of his time cleaning his rifle, sharpening his knife, and practicing his draw. He was a man on edge, his senses heightened, his body coiled and ready for action. Maggie watched him, her heart filled with a mixture of admiration and concern. She admired his strength, his resilience, his unwavering commitment to his cause, but she also worried about him, about the toll this life was taking on him. She tried to keep busy, cleaning the cabin, cooking meals, and tending to a small, neglected garden she discovered behind the house. It was a way to keep her mind occupied, to distract herself from the fear and uncertainty that loomed over them. They talked, sharing stories of their pasts, their hopes, and their regrets. Maggie learned more about Rhett's life in Abilene, the violence he'd witnessed, the loss he'd endured. He'd been a lawman, once a deputy sheriff, trying to bring order to a lawless town. But he'd become disillusioned, disgusted by the corruption and the brutality, and he'd turned to a life of drifting, taking on odd jobs, using his skills to survive. He spoke of his wife, Sarah, with a tenderness that surprised Maggie. She'd been the light of his life, a gentle soul who had brought him a measure of peace in a world of chaos. Her death, from a fever, had shattered him, leaving him with a deep-seated grief and a sense of guilt that he couldn't shake. "I should have been there," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I should have protected her." Maggie understood his pain. She'd felt the same guilt after Thomas's death, the nagging feeling that she could have done more, that she should have been a better wife. "You can't blame yourself, Rhett," she said, her voice soft. "Sometimes bad things happen, and there's nothing we can do to stop them." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a sadness that mirrored her own. "Maybe," he said. "But it doesn't make it any easier." Maggie shared her own story, the betrayal she'd suffered, the loss of her savings, her foolish trust in a man who had promised her the world and delivered only heartache. She told him about her life in St. Louis, her comfortable routine, the emptiness she'd felt even before her world had shattered. I thought I was happy, she said. But I was just going through the motions. I wasn't really living. Rhett listened patiently, his gaze unwavering. He didn't offer platitudes or empty reassurances. He simply listened, and his presence was a comfort in itself. You're a strong woman, Maggie, he said. You've survived a lot. You'll get through this. I don't know, Maggie said, her voice trembling. Sometimes I feel like I'm just drifting. Like I don't have a purpose. He reached out and took her hand, his touch surprisingly gentle. You have a purpose, Maggie, he said. You're helping me. You're fighting for what's right. And you're giving me a reason to keep fighting, too. His words sent a shiver through her. She looked at him, her heart filled with a warmth that she hadn't felt in a long time. She saw something in his eyes, a flicker of hope, a hint of something more than friendship. They were interrupted by a knock at the door, a sharp, insistent rapping that made them both jump. Rhett grabbed his rifle, his body tensing, his eyes narrowing. Who is it? He called out, his voice guarded. It's Mr. Abernathy, a voice replied. From the general store. Rhett relaxed slightly, lowering his rifle. He opened the door cautiously, peering out. Mr. Abernathy stood there, his face etched with concern. Rhett, Maggie, he said, his voice low and urgent. You need to leave.
Now.
Barlow's men are searching the town. They're coming this way. The whispers of a hidden past, Maggie realized, were about to give way to the harsh realities of the present. Their fragile sanctuary was about to be shattered, and they were running out of time. They had to make a choice, and they had to make it fast. Chapter 12. The Devil's Bargain. Mr. Abernathy's warning sent a jolt of adrenaline through Maggie and Rhett. They knew they had to act quickly, to escape before Barlow's men found them. We need to go, Rhett said, his voice urgent. There's a back way out through the garden. We can reach the hills, lose them in the canyons. Maggie nodded, her heart pounding. She grabbed her few belongings, stuffing them into a small bag. Rhett gathered his rifle and ammunition, his movements efficient and practiced. Mr. Abernathy stood by the door, his face etched with worry. Be careful, you two, he said. Barlow's a dangerous man, and he's got the whole town looking for you. We'll be all right, Mr. Abernathy, Rhett said. Thank you for the warning. They slipped out the back door, into the overgrown garden. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the landscape. They moved quickly and quietly, keeping low to the ground, using the overgrown vegetation for cover. They reached the edge of town and the beginning of the foothills. Rhett paused, his eyes scanning the surrounding area. We need to head for Devil's Canyon, he said. It's a maze of narrow passages and hidden caves. We can lose them there. Maggie nodded, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. She was tired and scared, but she was also determined. She wouldn't let Barlow win. She wouldn't let him take away the fragile hope she'd found in this unforgiving land. They climbed into the hills, the terrain becoming increasingly rough and treacherous. The rocks were sharp, the vegetation sparse, and the path was steep and winding. Maggie struggled to keep up with Rhett, her legs aching, her lungs burning. As they reached the entrance to Devil's Canyon, a narrow, twisting gorge that cut deep into the heart of the hills, they heard the sound of horses approaching. They're coming, Maggie gasped. They've found us. Rhett pulled her behind a large boulder, his body shielding hers. He peered out, his eyes narrowed, his rifle ready. A group of riders appeared, their figures silhouetted against the fading light. It was Barlow, leading a posse of his men. They were searching the area, their eyes scanning the landscape, their guns drawn. They're heading for the canyon, Rhett whispered. They know we're here. Maggie's heart sank. They were trapped. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded. Barlow's voice rang out, echoing through the canyon.
Dawson.
Maggie, we know you're in there. Come out with your hands up. It's over. Rhett looked at Maggie, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and despair. We're not going to make it, he said. They'll find us. Maggie shook her head.
No, she said.
We can't give up. There has to be another way. She remembered something Mr. Abernathy had told her, a story about a hidden passage in Devil's Canyon, a secret route known only to the local Native American tribe, a passage used long ago to evade pursuing cavalry. "There's a hidden passage," she said, her voice urgent. "Mr. Abernathy told me about it. It's somewhere near the back of the canyon.
We can use it to escape."
Rhett looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "Are you sure?" he asked. Maggie nodded.
"I'm sure," she said.
"We have to try." It was a desperate gamble, a long shot, but it was their only chance. They had to find the hidden passage before Barlow and his men found them. They crept deeper into the canyon, the walls closing in around them, the darkness deepening. The sound of Barlow's men grew closer, their voices echoing through the narrow passages. Maggie searched frantically for any sign of the hidden passage, her eyes scanning the rock walls, her hands feeling for any crevice, any opening. She remembered Mr. Abernathy's description, a narrow opening, concealed by a large, flat rock, marked with a symbol, a carving of a snake. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she saw it. A large, flat rock, partially hidden by a clump of bushes, with a faint carving of a snake on its surface.
"Rhett,"
she whispered. "Here. I found it." Rhett rushed to her side, his eyes widening in surprise. He examined the rock, his fingers tracing the carving of the snake. "You did it, Maggie," he said, a hint of admiration in his voice. Together, they pushed against the rock, straining with all their might. It moved, slowly at first, then with a grinding sound, revealing a narrow opening behind it. They squeezed through the opening, into a dark, narrow passage. They pulled the rock back into place, concealing the entrance, just as Barlow and his men reached the spot where they'd been hiding. They were safe for now, but they were also trapped in a dark, unknown passage, with no idea where it led. The devil's bargain, Maggie realized, had led them to an even more precarious situation. They had escaped one trap, only to find themselves in another. The air was cool and smelled damp. The faint sounds of their pursuers faded behind them. Hope, once again, mingled with a profound, unsettling fear. Chapter 13. Blood on the Horizon. The hidden passage was narrow and claustrophobic, forcing Maggie and Rhett to crawl on their hands and knees. The air was thick and damp, and the darkness was absolute. They moved slowly, cautiously, feeling their way along the rough, uneven walls. Maggie's heart pounded in her chest, her fear a tangible presence in the suffocating darkness. She didn't know where they were going or what awaited them at the other end, but she trusted Rhett, and she clung to the hope that they would find a way out. "Are you all right?" Rhett whispered, his voice close to her ear. "Yes," Maggie replied, trying to sound braver than she felt. "Just a little scared." "I know," he said, "but we'll make it. We always do." His words were meant to be reassuring, but they also carried a hint of fatalism, a recognition of the precariousness of their lives. They were survivors, yes, but they were also constantly on the edge, teetering on the brink of disaster. They continued to crawl, the passage twisting and turning, rising and falling. Maggie's knees were scraped and bruised, her hands raw, but she didn't complain. She focused on Rhett's presence, on his steady breathing, on the reassuring sound of his movements ahead of her. After what seemed like an eternity, they saw a faint glimmer of light ahead. They crawled towards it, their hearts filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension. The passage opened into a small, hidden cave, bathed in the soft, diffused light of the setting sun. The cave was dry and sheltered, with a small opening that overlooked a vast expanse of rolling hills and canyons. "We made it," Maggie said, her voice filled with relief. Rhett nodded, his eyes scanning the landscape. "We're on the other side of the canyon," he said. "Barlow won't find us here." They crawled out of the cave, into the open air. Maggie took a deep breath, feeling the cool breeze on her face, the warmth of the sun on her skin. She looked around, taking in the beauty of the surrounding landscape. It was a breathtaking view, a panorama of rugged hills, deep canyons, and endless sky. But their relief was short-lived. As they were admiring the view, they heard the sound of gunshots, echoing through the canyons. "What's that?" Maggie asked, her heart skipping a beat. Rhett listened intently, his eyes narrowing. "It's coming from the direction of the Hatfield Ranch," he said. "The McCoys must be attacking." Maggie remembered the conversation she'd overheard at the saloon, the plan for the McCoys to ambush the Hatfields. She'd tried to warn Rhett, but they'd been too busy running from Barlow to relay the information. "We have to go back," Rhett said, his voice urgent. "We have to help them." Maggie knew he was right. They couldn't just stand by and watch as the Hatfields were slaughtered. They had a responsibility, a debt to repay. But how? Maggie asked. "Barlow's men are still out there. We'll be caught." Rhett thought for a moment, his eyes scanning the landscape. "There's another way," he said. "A longer route through the hills. It'll take us a few hours, but we can avoid Barlow and his men." It was a risky plan, a dangerous undertaking, but they had no other choice. They had to try. They had to fight. They set off, running across the hills, the sound of gunshots growing louder with each passing mile. The sun was setting, casting long, bloody shadows across the landscape. The sky was a canvas of red and orange, a fiery reflection of the violence that was unfolding below. As they reached the crest of a hill, overlooking the Hatfield Ranch, they saw a scene of chaos and destruction. The ranch buildings were on fire, the cattle were scattered, and the ground was littered with bodies. The McCoys, a large group of armed men, were attacking the remaining Hatfields, who were outnumbered and outgunned. Rhett raised his rifle, his eyes filled with a cold fury. "Let's go," he said. They charged down the hill, towards the battle, their guns blazing. Blood on the horizon, Maggie realized, was not just a metaphor. It was a reality, a grim testament to the violence and the hatred that consumed this land. And they were right in the middle of it, fighting for their lives, fighting for what they believed in, fighting for a future that seemed increasingly uncertain. The sounds of gunfire and screams filled the air, a symphony of death and destruction. She saw Rhett, a figure of vengeance, his rifle spitting fire, his aim deadly accurate. She raised her own pistol, her hand trembling, and fired at the nearest McCoy, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and a strange, exhilarating sense of purpose. Chapter 14. A moment of grace, a lifetime of pain. The battle at the Hatfield Ranch was a brutal, chaotic melee. Maggie and Rhett fought side by side, their backs against the burning remnants of a barn, their guns blazing against the attacking McCoys. The air was thick with smoke, the smell of gunpowder, and the screams of the dying. Maggie had never experienced anything like it, the sheer intensity of the violence, the raw, visceral fear that gripped her heart. But she fought on, driven by a fierce determination to survive, to protect Rhett, to help the Hatfields, who were fighting desperately to defend their home. Rhett was a force of nature, his rifle spitting fire, his movements precise and deadly. He seemed to be everywhere at once, taking down McCoy men with ruthless efficiency. Maggie watched him, her heart filled with a mixture of awe and terror. She'd known he was a dangerous man, a skilled gunfighter, but she'd never seen him like this, a warrior consumed by a righteous fury. Maggie herself was surprised by her own courage, her own willingness to fight. She'd always considered herself a peaceful woman, a woman who avoided conflict, but she found a strength within herself that she didn't know she possessed. She fired her pistol, her hand trembling at first, but then steadier, her aim improving with each shot. She saw men fall, and she felt a pang of regret, a sense of sorrow for the lives lost, but she knew she had no choice. It was kill or be killed. The Hatfields, though outnumbered, fought bravely, their determination fueled by a desperate need to protect their land, their families, their way of life. They were ranchers, not gunfighters, but they fought with the ferocity of cornered animals. As the battle raged, Maggie saw Rhett fall, a bullet striking him in the shoulder. She cried out, her heart leaping into her throat. She rushed to his side, dropping her pistol, her hands reaching for him.
"Rhett!"
she screamed. "Are you all right?" He lay on the ground, his face pale, his eyes clenched in pain. He dropped his rifle, and blood was seeping through his shirt, staining the fabric a dark crimson.
I'm all right, he gasped.
Just a flesh wound. Maggie knew it was more than that. The bullet had hit him hard, and he was losing blood fast. She ripped a strip of cloth from her dress and pressed it against the wound, trying to stem the flow. "We need to get you out of here," she said, her voice trembling. "No," Rhett said, his voice weak but firm. We have to keep fighting. We can't let them win." Maggie knew he was right, but she couldn't bear the thought of leaving him there, wounded and vulnerable. She looked around, desperate for help, but the battle was still raging, and there was no one to turn to. Suddenly, she saw a figure approaching, a man on horseback, riding towards them through the chaos. It was Sheriff Barlow, his face contorted with rage, his gun drawn.
"Dawson,"
he shouted. "You're finished." He raised his gun, aiming at Rhett, his finger tightening on the trigger. Maggie knew she had to act fast. She grabbed Rhett's fallen rifle, her hands shaking, her heart pounding. She'd never fired a rifle before, but she had no choice. It was Rhett's life or Barlow's. She raised the rifle, her aim unsteady, her finger on the trigger. She closed her eyes for a split second, took a deep breath, and fired. The shot rang out, echoing through the chaos. Maggie opened her eyes, her vision blurry, her ears ringing. She saw Barlow slump in his saddle, his gun falling to the ground. He stared at her, his eyes wide with disbelief, then slowly slid off his horse, collapsing in a heap on the dusty earth. Maggie lowered the rifle, her body trembling, her mind reeling. She'd killed a man. She'd taken a life. She felt a wave of nausea, a surge of horror and regret, but she also felt a strange sense of relief, a sense of having done what she had to do. The tide of the battle began to turn. With Barlow dead and Rhett and Maggie still fighting, the McCoys began to lose heart. They'd expected an easy victory, but they'd met unexpected resistance. They began to retreat, fleeing the ranch, leaving behind their dead and wounded. The remaining Hatfields, exhausted but victorious, gathered around Maggie and Rhett. They were grateful for their help, their courage, their willingness to risk their lives for a cause that wasn't even their own. They helped Maggie get Rhett to the ranch house, where they tended to his wound. It was serious, but not life-threatening. The bullet had passed through his shoulder, missing any major arteries or bones.
He was lucky.
As Maggie sat by Rhett's bedside, watching him sleep, she reflected on the events of the day. She'd witnessed violence, death, and destruction, but she'd also witnessed courage, resilience, and a moment of grace, a moment when she'd acted instinctively, saving Rhett's life, changing the course of the battle. It was a moment that would stay with her forever, a moment that had transformed her, a moment that had revealed a strength she didn't know she possessed. But it was also a moment tinged with a lifetime of pain, the pain of taking a life, the pain of seeing Rhett wounded, the pain of knowing that the violence and the hatred would continue, that the peace she longed for was still a distant dream. She gently touched his hand. He stirred, but didn't wake. Chapter 15. The Sheriff's Deceit. The days following the battle at the Hatfield Ranch were a blur of activity and anxiety. Rhett, though weakened by his injury, was slowly recovering, his resilience and determination pushing him forward. Maggie tended to him tirelessly, changing his bandages, preparing his meals, and keeping him company. She rarely left his side, her concern for him overshadowing everything else. The Hatfields, grateful for their help, offered them shelter and protection. They insisted that Maggie and Rhett stay at the ranch until Rhett was fully recovered, and they provided them with everything they needed. The news of Sheriff Barlow's death spread quickly through Dust Devil, causing a mixture of shock, relief, and apprehension. Barlow had been a powerful and feared figure, and his demise left a void in the town's already fragile power structure. The McCoys, reeling from their defeat at the ranch, were lying low, regrouping and plotting their next move. They knew that with Barlow gone, their position was weakened, and they were determined to regain control. Maggie and Rhett knew they were still in danger. Barlow's death had made them even more of a target, and the McCoys would be seeking revenge. They couldn't stay at the Hatfield Ranch forever, and they needed to plan their next move. One evening, as Maggie and Rhett were sitting on the porch of the ranch house, watching the sunset, a rider approached. It was Mr. Abernathy from the general store. He looked tired and worried, his face etched with concern. "Rhett, Maggie," he said, dismounting his horse. "I have news. Bad news." He explained that the remaining town council members, under pressure from the McCoys, had appointed a new sheriff, a man named Jedediah Stone. Stone was a known associate of the McCoys, a ruthless and corrupt individual who would undoubtedly continue Barlow's reign of terror. "They're also spreading lies about you too," Mr. Abernathy continued. "They're saying you murdered Barlow in cold blood, that you're outlaws and troublemakers. They've put a price on your heads." Maggie's heart sank. This was worse than she'd feared. They were not only fugitives, but they were being framed for a crime they hadn't committed. "We need to clear our names," Maggie said. "We can't let them get away with this." Rhett nodded, his jaw set with determination. "We need proof," he said. "Proof of Barlow's corruption, proof of the McCoys' involvement. Something that will expose them for what they are." Mr. Abernathy hesitated, his eyes shifting nervously. "There might be something," he said. "Barlow kept a ledger. A record of his dealings, his bribes, his illegal activities. It's hidden somewhere in his office." It was a long shot, a dangerous gamble, but it was their only hope. They had to find Barlow's ledger, to expose his deceit and clear their names. "We need to get into the sheriff's office," Rhett said. "Tonight." Maggie knew it was a risky plan, but she also knew they had no other choice. They couldn't run forever. They had to fight back. "I'll go with you," she said, her voice firm. Rhett looked at her, his eyes filled with concern. "No, Maggie," he said. "It's too dangerous. I'll go alone." "No, Maggie insisted. "We're in this together. I won't let you face this alone." Rhett hesitated, then nodded. He knew he couldn't dissuade her. She was stubborn, determined, and fiercely loyal. They waited until nightfall, then set off for Dust Devil, under the cover of darkness. They moved cautiously, avoiding the main streets, keeping to the shadows. They reached the sheriff's office, a small, two-story building that stood on the edge of town. The building was dark and silent, seemingly deserted. Rhett picked the lock on the back door, his movements deft and practiced. They slipped inside, into the darkness, their hearts pounding in their chests. The sheriff's deceit, Maggie realized, was not just a personal betrayal, but a betrayal of the entire town, a cancer that had infected the very heart of their community. And they were about to expose it, to cut it out no matter the cost. The air was thick with dust, and the faint scent of stale tobacco. This was the place where Barlow had ruled, where he had spun his web of lies. Chapter 16. Crossroads of Destiny. The interior of the sheriff's office was sparsely furnished, a desk, a few chairs, a gun rack, and a large, iron safe in the corner. The air was thick with dust and the faint scent of stale tobacco, a lingering testament to Barlow's presence. Rhett moved cautiously, his hand on his gun, his eyes scanning the room. Maggie followed close behind, her heart pounding in her chest, her senses on high alert. "The ledger must be in the safe," Rhett whispered. "Barlow wouldn't have kept it anywhere else." He examined the safe, a large, formidable-looking object with a complex combination lock. He tried a few obvious combinations, but nothing worked. "I can't crack it," he said, his voice frustrated. "It's too complicated." Maggie looked around the room, her eyes searching for any clue, any hint of the combination. She noticed a small, framed photograph on Barlow's desk, a picture of a young girl, presumably his daughter. On the back of the frame, a series of numbers were scrawled in pencil. "Rhett," she said, her voice urgent. "Look at this." Rhett examined the numbers, his eyes widening in recognition. "It's a date," he said. "His daughter's birthday. It could be the combination." He tried the numbers on the safe, his fingers working the dial with practiced precision. There was a click, and the heavy door swung open. Inside the safe, they found a stack of documents, a few bundles of cash, and a small, leather-bound ledger. Rhett grabbed the ledger, his hands trembling with anticipation. He opened the ledger and began to read, his eyes scanning the pages, his face growing grim with each entry. The ledger was a detailed record of Barlow's corrupt dealings, his bribes, his payoffs, his illegal activities. It listed names, dates, and amounts, a damning indictment of the sheriff's deceit and the McCoys' involvement. "This is it," Rhett said, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and triumph. "This is the proof we need." But their triumph was short-lived. As they were leaving the office, they heard the sound of approaching footsteps, voices, and the jingle of spurs. "Someone's coming," Maggie whispered, her heart leaping into her throat. They quickly closed the safe, grabbed the ledger, and slipped out the back door, just as a group of men entered the front. It was the new sheriff, Jedediah Stone, and a posse of McCoy men. They ran through the darkness, heading for the outskirts of town, for the safety of the hills. But Stone and his men were close behind, their shouts echoing through the night. "They're gaining on us," Maggie gasped, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Rhett knew they couldn't outrun them. They needed to find a place to hide, to make a stand. "There's an old abandoned mine shaft up ahead," he said. "We can hold them off there." They reached the mine shaft, a dark, gaping hole in the side of a hill. They scrambled inside, into the darkness, their hearts pounding. Stone and his men surrounded the mine shaft, their guns drawn. "Come out, Dawson." "Maggie," Stone shouted. "You're surrounded. There's nowhere to run." Rhett looked at Maggie, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and despair. "This is it, Maggie," he said. "This is where we make our stand." It was a crossroads of destiny, a moment of truth. They were trapped, outnumbered, and outgunned, but they were not defeated. They had the ledger, the proof of Barlow's corruption, and they had each other. Maggie nodded, her eyes meeting his. "We're ready," she said, her voice firm. She grabbed a loose piece of timber, ready to defend herself, to fight alongside Rhett, to face whatever fate awaited them. The darkness of the mine shaft seemed to press in on them, a suffocating weight, but it also offered a strange sense of protection, a hidden sanctuary in the heart of the storm. They were two souls, bound together by circumstance, by shared danger, and by a growing affection that transcended the chaos that surrounded them. They were ready to fight, to die if necessary for the truth, for justice, and for the fragile hope of a future together. The sound of Stone's voice, taunting them, fueled their resolve. They would not surrender. Chapter 17. The Weight of a Promise. The standoff at the abandoned mine shaft stretched on, a tense and suffocating silence punctuated by the occasional shout from Sheriff Stone and his men. Maggie and Rhett huddled in the darkness, their backs against the cold, damp wall of the mine, their weapons ready. They knew they were in a precarious situation, trapped and outnumbered, but they were determined to fight, to hold out as long as they could. "They're waiting for daylight," Rhett whispered, his voice barely audible. "They'll rush us then." Maggie nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew he was right. They couldn't stay in the mine shaft forever. They needed a plan, a way to escape, a way to turn the tables on Stone and his men. "We have the ledger," Maggie said, her voice firm. "That's our leverage. We need to use it." Rhett looked at her, his eyes searching hers.
"How?"
he asked. "We need to get it to someone who can expose Stone and the McCoys," Maggie said. "Someone in authority, someone who can bring them to justice." She remembered hearing stories of a circuit judge, a man named Judge Thompson, who was known for his integrity and his fairness. He was due to arrive in a neighboring town, Oakhaven, in a few days. "Judge Thompson," Maggie said. "He's our only hope. We need to get the ledger to him." It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was their only chance. They had to find a way to escape the mine shaft, to evade Stone and his men, and to reach Oakhaven before it was too late. "I'll create a diversion," Rhett said. "You make a run for it. Get to Oakhaven. Find Judge Thompson." Maggie shook her head. "No, Rhett," she said. "We're in this together. I won't leave you." Rhett looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and frustration. "Maggie," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "You have to. It's the only way. I can hold them off, give you time to escape." But Maggie hesitated, her heart torn. She couldn't bear the thought of leaving him, of facing this danger alone. "No buts," Rhett said. "It's the only way. You have to trust me." He reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a warmth through her, a sense of connection that transcended the fear and the uncertainty. "I made you a promise, Maggie," he said, his voice low and husky. "I promise to keep you safe. And I intend to keep that promise." The weight of his promise, the sincerity in his eyes, the strength of his grip on her hand, convinced her. She knew he was right. It was their only hope. "All right, Rhett," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I'll do it. But you be careful." He smiled, a faint, sad smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I always am," he said. He explained his plan. He would create a diversion, drawing Stone and his men away from the mine entrance, giving Maggie a chance to slip away unnoticed. He would use dynamite, a few sticks he'd found in the mine, to create a loud explosion, distracting them and creating confusion. It was a dangerous plan, a risky maneuver, but it was their only option. They had to act fast before daylight, before Stone and his men decided to rush the mine. Rhett gathered the dynamite, his movements precise and efficient. He set the fuse, his hand steady, his face grim. "When you hear the explosion, run, Maggie," he said. "Don't look back. Just run." He lit the fuse, the small flames sputtering in the darkness. He handed Maggie the ledger, his fingers brushing hers. "Get this to Judge Thompson," he said. And be careful." He pushed her towards the mine entrance, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and fear. Maggie hesitated for a moment, her heart aching, her eyes filled with tears. She stammered, unable to find the words to express the emotions that surged through her. "Go, Maggie," Rhett urged.
"Now."
Maggie turned and ran, her footsteps echoing in the darkness, her heart pounding in her chest. She heard the explosion behind her, a deafening roar that shook the ground, followed by shouts and screams. She didn't look back. She ran, as fast as she could, away from the mine, away from the danger, towards the hope of a future that suddenly seemed incredibly fragile and uncertain. The weight of the ledger in her hands was a reminder of the responsibility she carried, the promise she had to keep, the trust that Rhett had placed in her. She ran, with the echoes of the explosion ringing in her ears, and the image of Rhett's face, etched in her memory, a beacon guiding her through the darkness. Chapter 18. Running from ghosts, running towards hope. Maggie ran through the night, her lungs burning, her legs aching, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away from the mine, away from Stone and his men, and towards Oakhaven, towards Judge Thompson, towards the hope of justice and a future free from fear. She followed a faint trail, barely visible in the darkness, relying on her instincts and the distant memory of a map she'd seen in Mr. Abernathy's store. She stumbled and fell, scraping her knees and hands, but she pushed herself up, forcing herself to keep moving. She couldn't stop. She couldn't give up. She had to keep running. She thought of Rhett, back at the mine, facing Stone and his men alone. She prayed that he was still alive, that he was holding them off, that he would find a way to escape. She clung to the hope that they would be reunited, that they would have a chance to build a life together, a life free from violence and fear. As the first rays of dawn painted the eastern sky in hues of pale pink and gold, Maggie reached the crest of a hill, overlooking a vast expanse of rolling plains. She paused, catching her breath, her eyes scanning the horizon. In the distance, she saw a small town, nestled in a valley, surrounded by trees and fields. It had to be Oakhaven. She continued running, her pace quickening, her hope renewed. She was close, so close, to reaching her destination, to delivering the ledger, to exposing Stone and the McCoys. But as she approached the town, she saw a group of riders heading towards her, their figures silhouetted against the rising sun. They were armed, and they were riding fast. It was Stone's men. They'd found her. Maggie's heart sank. She was exhausted, her body aching, her spirit flagging. She couldn't outrun them. She was trapped. She stopped running, her shoulders slumping, her head bowed. She closed her eyes, bracing herself for the inevitable. This was it, she thought. This was the end. But then, she heard a different sound, a different rhythm of hooves, approaching from behind her. She turned, her eyes widening in disbelief. It was Rhett. He was riding towards her, his horse galloping at full speed, his face grim, his eyes blazing. He reached her, reining in his horse, his chest heaving, his face covered in dust and sweat. "Maggie," he shouted. "Are you all right?"
Rhett,
Maggie cried, her voice filled with relief and joy. "You're alive. How did you?" "I'll explain later," he said, his voice urgent. "We need to go."
now.
He reached down and pulled her up onto his horse behind him. He spurred the horse forward, and they galloped away, leaving Stone's men behind, their shouts fading in the distance. They rode hard, pushing the horse to its limits, heading for Oakhaven, for Judge Thompson, for the hope of justice. They were running from ghosts, the ghosts of their pasts, the ghosts of violence and betrayal, but they were also running towards hope, the hope of a future together, a future free from fear. They were running, side by side, their hearts beating as one, their destinies intertwined. The rising sun illuminated their faces, revealing a mixture of exhaustion, fear, and a fierce, unwavering determination. They had survived, against all odds, and they were not giving up. They would reach Oakhaven. They would deliver the ledger. They would expose the truth. They will make the sun rise upon a different future. Chapter 19. The Heart's Reckoning. They reached Oakhaven just as the town was waking up, the streets bustling with activity, the air filled with the sounds of horses, wagons, and the chatter of early risers. Rhett and Maggie, exhausted and covered in dust, rode straight to the courthouse, a small but imposing building that stood in the center of the town square. They dismounted, their legs stiff and sore, their bodies aching from the long, hard ride. Maggie clutched the ledger to her chest, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and apprehension. This was it, the moment of truth. They entered the courthouse, their footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. A clerk, startled by their appearance, looked up from his desk. "We need to see Judge Thompson," Rhett said, his voice firm. "It's urgent." The clerk hesitated, his eyes assessing them with suspicion.
"The judge is busy," he said.
"He's preparing for court." "This can't wait," Maggie said, her voice trembling but determined. "It's a matter of life and death." The clerk, seeing the desperation in their eyes, relented. He led them to a small, private chamber, where Judge Thompson was sitting at a desk, reviewing documents. The judge, a tall, distinguished-looking man with a stern but kindly face, looked up as they entered. "What is the meaning of this?" he asked, his voice sharp. Rhett stepped forward, his hand on his gun, his eyes wary. "We need your help, Judge," he said. "We have evidence of corruption, murder, and conspiracy. Evidence that implicates the sheriff of Dust Devil, Jedediah Stone, and the McCoy family." He placed the ledger on the judge's desk, his hand trembling slightly. "This ledger belonged to Sheriff Barlow," he explained. "It details his illegal activities, his bribes, his payoffs. It proves that Stone and the McCoys are working together, that they're responsible for the violence in Dust Devil." Judge Thompson examined the ledger, his eyes scanning the pages, his face growing grim with each entry. He listened intently as Rhett and Maggie recounted the events of the past few weeks, the gunfight at the Hatfield Ranch, Barlow's death, the escape from the mine shaft, the pursuit by Stone and his men. He asked questions, probing for details, testing their credibility. He listened patiently, his gaze unwavering, his expression unreadable. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he closed the ledger, his face set with determination. "This is serious," he said, his voice grave. "Very serious. If this evidence is true, It could bring down a whole network of corruption. He looked at Rhett and Maggie, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and concern. "You two have been through a lot," he said. "You've risked your lives to bring this to light." He paused, his gaze sweeping over them, taking in their exhausted faces, their dust-covered clothes, their unwavering determination. "I believe you," he said, his voice firm. "And I will act on this. I will issue warrants for the arrest of Jedediah Stone and the McCoy family. I will send a detachment of marshals to Dust Devil to restore order and bring them to justice." Maggie and Rhett felt a wave of relief wash over them. They had done it. They had exposed the truth, and they had found someone who would listen, someone who would act. But their relief was tempered by a lingering sense of unease. They knew the fight wasn't over. Stone and the McCoys wouldn't give up easily. There would be more violence, more bloodshed before this was truly finished. As they were leaving the courthouse, Rhett turned to Maggie, his eyes filled with a depth of emotion that she'd never seen before. "Maggie," he said, his voice low and husky. I need to tell you something." Maggie's heart skipped a beat. She knew what he was going to say, and she felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation. "I love you, Maggie," he said. "I've loved you since the moment I saw you, standing there by that broken wagon, your eyes filled with fear and defiance." Maggie's eyes filled with tears. "I love you too, Rhett," she said, her voice trembling. "I've loved you since you saved my life. Back in the canyon, when you showed me that even in the darkest of times, there's still hope." They embraced, their bodies clinging together, their hearts beating as one. It was a moment of profound connection, a moment of love and tenderness amidst the chaos and uncertainty of their lives. It was a moment that transcended the violence and the fear, a moment that promised a future together, a reckoning of the heart. But even in that moment of joy, they knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. They had a fight on their hands, a fight for justice, a fight for peace, a fight for their future. The sun had risen fully. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. The news of Judge Thompson's warrants and the impending arrival of federal marshals spread through Dust Devil like wildfire, igniting a powder keg of tension and anticipation. The town was divided, with some supporting Maggie and Rhett, grateful for their courage in exposing the truth, while others, loyal to the McCoys and Stone, seethed with resentment and prepared for a final, desperate stand. Maggie and Rhett, knowing they were still in danger, remained hidden at the Hatfield Ranch, protected by the grateful ranchers who had become their unlikely allies. They knew that Stone and the McCoys wouldn't surrender without a fight, and they prepared for the inevitable confrontation, a showdown that would determine the fate of Dust Devil and their own uncertain future. The federal marshals, a dozen strong, arrived in Dust Devil, their presence a symbol of law and order, a promise of justice. They were led by Marshal Cole, a seasoned veteran with a reputation for fairness and a steely determination. He met with Maggie and Rhett, listening to their story, examining the ledger, and assuring them that justice would be served. "We'll arrest Stone and the McCoys," Marshal Cole said, "and we'll bring them to trial. But we need your help. You know the town, you know the people. You can help us identify the conspirators, the ones who were involved in Barlow's corruption." Maggie and Rhett agreed to help, their commitment to justice unwavering. They knew it was a dangerous task, but they were determined to see it through, to bring an end to the violence and the fear that had gripped Dust Devil for so long. The marshals, with Maggie and Rhett's guidance, began rounding up the conspirators, arresting those who had been implicated in Barlow's illegal activities. They met with resistance, some of the McCoys' loyalists refusing to surrender, resulting in a few brief but violent skirmishes. Finally, they reached the McCoy Ranch, the stronghold of the family, the epicenter of the conspiracy. Stone and the remaining McCoy men were holed up inside, heavily armed and prepared for a siege. Marshal Cole, hoping to avoid further bloodshed, sent a message to Stone, demanding his surrender. Stone refused, his response a defiant volley of gunfire. The final confrontation had begun. The marshals surrounded the ranch house, taking cover behind rocks, trees, and outbuildings. They returned fire, the sound of gunfire echoing through the valley, a deafening roar that shattered the peace of the morning. Maggie and Rhett, armed with rifles, fought alongside the marshals, their determination fueled by a fierce desire for justice and a longing for peace. They were not gunfighters, but they were survivors, and they were fighting for their lives, for their future, for the hope of a better tomorrow. The battle raged for hours, a brutal, back-and-forth exchange of gunfire. Men fell on both sides, the ground stained with blood, the air filled with the screams of the dying. Maggie fought bravely, her aim steady, her courage unwavering. She saw Rhett, fighting with a fierce intensity, his rifle spitting fire, his movements precise and deadly. He was a warrior, a protector, a man fighting for the woman he loved, for the future they both dreamed of. As the battle reached its climax, Maggie saw Stone, his face contorted with rage, his eyes filled with a desperate madness, aiming his rifle at Rhett.
Rhett!
Maggie screamed, her voice filled with terror. She raised her own rifle, her finger tightening on the trigger. She fired, her shot hitting Stone in the chest, sending him sprawling to the ground. The remaining McCoy men, seeing their leader fall, lost heart. They surrendered, dropping their weapons, their faces filled with defeat. The battle was over. The final confrontation had ended. Silence descended upon the valley, a profound, unsettling silence, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the sobs of the grieving. The cost of victory had been high, but justice had prevailed. Maggie rushed to Rhett's side, her heart pounding with fear. He was unharmed, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and gratitude. "You saved my life, Maggie," he said, his voice trembling. "We saved each other," she replied, her voice choked with emotion. They embraced, their bodies clinging together, their hearts beating as one. They had survived. They had won. They had faced their final confrontation, both with the external forces of evil and the internal demons of their pasts. The horizons stretched clear. Hearts were healed, at least a little. And they knew, with a certainty that defied the harshness of the land, that they would face the future together, whatever it may hold. The marshals began the grim task of rounding up the prisoners, tending to the wounded, and restoring order to the town. The sun began to set. Epilogue. The months that followed the final confrontation at the McCoy Ranch were a time of healing, rebuilding, and transformation for Dust Devil and for Maggie and Rhett. The town, freed from the grip of corruption and violence, slowly began to recover, its wounds gradually healing, its spirit renewed. Jedediah Stone and the surviving members of the McCoy family were brought to trial, convicted of their crimes, and sentenced to long prison terms. The ledger, the damning evidence of their deceit, played a crucial role in their conviction, a testament to Maggie and Rhett's courage and determination. Dust Devil elected a new sheriff, a man of integrity and fairness, who worked tirelessly to restore law and order, to rebuild trust, and to create a sense of community. The town slowly began to thrive, its businesses flourishing, its people embracing a future free from fear. Maggie and Rhett, hailed as heroes, were offered positions of leadership in the town, but they declined, preferring a quieter life, a life of peace and companionship. They rebuilt the small cabin on the outskirts of town, making it their home, a sanctuary where they could heal, rebuild, and find solace in each other's company. They married, in a simple ceremony at the newly built town church, surrounded by the friends they had made, the people who had supported them, the community that had embraced them. It was a joyous occasion, a celebration of love, resilience, and the promise of a new beginning. Maggie found a sense of purpose in her new life, helping to establish a small school for the town's children, sharing her knowledge and her love of learning. She became a beloved figure in the community, a symbol of hope and resilience, a woman who had overcome adversity and found happiness in the most unlikely of places. Rhett, though still haunted by his past, found a measure of peace in his new life with Maggie. He worked as a ranch hand, using his skills with horses and cattle to earn a living, finding solace in the quiet rhythm of the land. He became a mentor to the younger men in the town, sharing his wisdom and his experience, guiding them towards a life of honesty and integrity. They often sat on the porch of their cabin, watching the sunsets, their hands intertwined, their hearts filled with gratitude and love. They had faced their demons, they had overcome adversity, and they had found, in each other, a love that transcended the violence and the fear, a love that was both a refuge and a strength. Years passed, and their love deepened, their bond strengthened by the shared experiences, the challenges overcome, the quiet moments of companionship. They grew old together, their hair turning silver, their faces lined with the marks of time, but their eyes still sparkling with the same love and affection that had drawn them together in the midst of chaos and uncertainty. One evening, as they were sitting on the porch, watching the sun set in a blaze of glory, painting the sky in hues of red, orange, and purple, Maggie turned to Rhett, her eyes filled with a lifetime of love. "We did it, Rhett," she said, her voice soft but firm. "We found our new beginning." Rhett smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners, his hand tightening around hers. "We did, Maggie," he said. "We found our home." And as the stars began to appear in the vast, darkening sky, they sat there, together, two souls bound by love, by shared experience, and by the unwavering hope of a future filled with peace, companionship, and the enduring beauty of the unforgiving, yet ultimately forgiving, land they had come to call home. The vast sky, once a symbol of indifference, now seemed to embrace them, a silent witness to their enduring love, a testament to their resilience, a promise of peace that stretched out to the distant, shimmering horizon. The air was clear and still. The end.